there is a sound that still wakes me up at night. It's not a scream, not an alarm. It's the soft click of a front door lock changing. That small, ordinary sound was the moment my whole life split into a before and an after. If you had told me, even 1 year earlier, that this sound would come to haunt me more than any nightmare I'd ever had, I would have laughed at you. But grief and betrayal don't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they arrive quietly, dressed as an ordinary Tuesday. My name is Nyla, and I was 31 years old the day my own brother locked me out of the house I was born in.
I know how that sounds.
People here evicted by my brother, and they picture some cold stranger, some distant relative with no history between us, someone who was never really family to begin with. But that's not what happened to me. Faison wasn't a stranger. He was the boy I used to carry on my hip when I was 12, and he was 3, wrapping his small arms around my neck when he was scared of the neighbor's dog. He was the one I stayed up with when he had fevers, pressing cool cloths to his forehead at 2 in the morning while our mother slept, exhausted from her second job. He was the one I walked to school every single morning for 6 years because our mother worked 2 jobs and our father was already gone by then. Faison was my responsibility before he was ever my rival. And for the first 26 years of his life, I never once imagined those two things could switch places. Let me take you back, before any of the pain, before any of the locks and the boxes and the cold words on a porch. Let me tell you about the house itself because you need to understand what it meant before you understand what was taken. Our house sat on the corner of a quiet street, painted a soft yellow that had faded over the decades into something closer to sand. It had a crooked gate that squeaked no matter how much oil you put on it. My father used to joke that the squeak was the house's way of announcing visitors, better than any doorbell. There was a mango tree in the backyard that my father planted the year I was born, and every summer, that tree dropped fruit onto the tin roof of the storage shed. Thud, thud, thud. That sound was the metronome of my entire childhood. I used to lie awake on hot summer nights, counting the thuds instead of sheep, imagining each one was my father tossing invisible mangoes just to make me smile in the dark. That house wasn't just brick and paint to me. It was the last place I remembered my father's laugh, a deep, rolling laugh that used to shake the walls when he told his terrible jokes at dinner. It was where my mother taught me to cook her mother's recipes, standing behind me with her hands over mine, guiding the knife through onions until my eyes watered and she would laugh and say, "That's not the onions. That's your soul crying happy tears." It was where Faison took his first steps in the living room, right in front of the old sofa with the flowered cushions, and I was the one who caught him before he could fall, my arms outstretched, my heart hammering with a kind of pride I didn't yet have words for. I remember every crack in that ceiling. I remember the exact spot on the 3rd stair that creaked, the one Faison and I used to skip when we were sneaking down for midnight snacks, giggling in the dark, terrified our mother would wake up and catch us. I remember the smell of the kitchen on Eid mornings, cardamom and fried dough and my mother's perfume all mixing together into something I can still conjure in my mind even now, years later, sitting somewhere else entirely. When our father died, I was 19. It was sudden, a heart attack at his workplace, the kind of thing that happens on an ordinary Wednesday, and then nothing is ordinary again. Faison was only 10. I remember holding his hand at the funeral, feeling him shake, not fully understanding what gone meant at that age, only understanding that our father's chair at the dinner table would stay empty forever after that day. Our mother tried to hold everything together after that. She took on extra shifts. She stopped buying new clothes for herself, so that Faison and I never noticed a difference in what we had. But grief has a way of hollowing a person out slowly, the way water erodes stone, not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 invisible ones. Within 4 years, she was gone too. Heart failure. The doctors said, though I've always believed her heart simply gave up from carrying too much for too long, from grieving a husband while raising 2 children entirely alone, from working herself past the point her body could sustain. I was 23 when I buried my mother. I remember standing at that grave, Faison beside me, 14 years old, silent, staring at the freshly turned earth, and I remember making a promise to myself, one I never said out loud to anyone. I promised that no matter what happened, I would make sure Faison never felt the ground disappear beneath him the way it had disappeared beneath me. At 23, I became something between an older sister and a mother. I finished my own studies late, working nights, so I could pay for Faison's school fees during the day. I skipped things other girls my age were doing. No long trips with friends, no easy young adulthood, no carefree years of figuring out who I wanted to be. There was a boy at home who needed dinner on the table, and someone to check his homework, someone to attend his parent-teacher meetings and sign his permission slips and sit up worrying when he came home late from cricket practice. I don't say this to make myself sound like a saint. Truthfully, I never once resented it while it was happening, not once. I loved him too much to see it as sacrifice. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, the way breathing feels natural, the way a heartbeat doesn't ask for gratitude. I say all of this now because you need to understand what that house meant to me and what Faison meant to me before I tell you what he did. You need to understand that this wasn't a story of two distant relatives fighting over property. This was a story of two people who had survived loss together, who had built an entire world out of each other's presence, and how even that kind of bond can be quietly, methodically dismantled. By the time Faison turned 26, he had changed. Not overnight. It crept in slowly, the way damp creeps into a wall, until one day you notice the paint is bubbling and you don't know when it started, only that it's been happening for longer than you realized. He got a good job at a logistics company, something that made him proud, something that gave him a taste of independence he hadn't experienced before. And then he got married to a woman named Rabia. I want to be fair here. I don't blame her for everything that happened. Not entirely. People are shaped by more than one hand. But something shifted in our home after their wedding, something I felt in my bones before I could ever have named it out loud. There were new opinions about how things should be run. There were comments, small at first, almost playful, about how the house was too old, how it needed to be modernized, how certain rooms were wasted space. My sewing room, where I used to mend our school uniforms as children, was called just clutter now. My father's old study, where his books still sat exactly as he'd left them, was called a room that could be turned into something useful. I laughed those comments off at first. I told myself Rabia was simply adjusting to a new home, the way any new wife might, offering fresh eyes on old spaces. I welcomed her into our lives with open arms, cooking her favorite dishes, including her in every family decision, treating her the way I would have wanted an older sister to treat me if our roles had been reversed. But I noticed Faison pulling away from me in small ways that I chose for a long time not to examine too closely. He stopped calling me for advice the way he used to, about work problems, about arguments with friends, about the small daily confusions of adult life. He stopped sitting with me in the evenings the way we used to, drinking tea on the back porch and talking about nothing and everything, watching the sun go down behind the mango tree. I told myself it was normal, a married man settling into his new life, a new priority, a natural shift in the center of gravity of his world. I told myself I should be happy for him, that this was simply what growing up looked like, that I shouldn't cling to the version of him that needed me the way a child needs a parent. What I didn't know was that behind those quiet evenings, behind the polite dinners and the careful small talk, papers were being signed. Conversations were happening without me in rooms I wasn't invited into. A slow, deliberate rearrangement of my entire future was already well underway, and I was too busy loving my brother to notice that love was no longer being returned in the same currency. Our father had left the house without a formal will, a common mistake in families who never imagine tragedy will visit them twice, who assume there will always be more time to sort out the paperwork of love. After our mother passed, the property had technically been left in a kind of limbo, informally understood as belonging to both of us, since I was the one who had paid the taxes, the repairs, the maintenance for years while Faison was still a student living under my care. But understanding is not the same as documentation. And documentation, I would soon learn in the most painful way possible, is what wins in the end, no matter how much love you've poured into a place, no matter how many years you gave without asking for a single signature in return. I remember the exact evening it happened.
It was a Tuesday.
Ordinary in every way until it wasn't. I had just come home from work, tired, carrying groceries in both arms, Tomatoes, lentils, a bag of the rice Faison liked, because I was planning to cook his favorite dinner that night for no particular reason at all, just because I loved him, and it had been a while since I'd made an effort like that. I was thinking about nothing more complicated than what spices to add, humming some old song under my breath. Faison was standing in the doorway when I walked up the path, and Rabia was behind him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable in a way that should have warned me. There was an envelope in his hand, slightly bent at the corners, like he'd been holding it for longer than he meant to before finally working up the nerve. "Nyla," he said, and his voice was flat in a way I had never heard from him before. Not angry, not sad, just strangely, deliberately empty, like he'd rehearsed this moment enough times to strip all the feeling out of it. "We need to talk." I remember laughing, actually laughing, the grocery bags cutting red lines into my fingers, because I thought he was about to tell me they were expecting a baby, or that he'd gotten a promotion, or some other piece of news that would explain the strange formality in his posture. I had no idea. How could I have known? This was my little brother, the boy whose fevers I sat through until dawn. The boy I taught to ride a bicycle in the very street outside that door, running behind him with my hand hovering near the seat, letting go before he even knew I had, watching him wobble and then find his balance and pedal off into the sunlight, shrieking with joy. "The house is under my name now," he said, and each word landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through me that I could feel in my chest, my stomach, the backs of my knees. Dad's lawyer helped finalize it last year. I didn't want to bring it up until everything was settled. I stood there with a bag of vegetables cutting into my fingers, and I didn't understand the words at first.
Not really.
It was like hearing a sentence in a language I used to know but had somehow forgotten overnight. My mind kept trying to rearrange the words into something that made sense, something that didn't mean what it obviously meant. "What do you mean, settled?" I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. And that's when Rabia stepped forward, her voice calm in a way that felt almost rehearsed, almost kind on the surface, which somehow made it worse. "It's better this way, Nyla. You're not married. You don't have a family of your own to think about. Faison does. This house should go to whoever is building something here." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, the way I had to sit with it, standing in the doorway of the only home I had ever known, holding groceries I had bought with money I earned to feed a family that had just told me I didn't belong in it anymore. Building something here. As though the 8 years I had spent raising Faison in that very house, cooking in that very kitchen, paying that very electricity bill, hadn't been building anything at all. As though love that doesn't come stamped with a marriage certificate or a child's birth certificate simply doesn't count as a life being built. I looked at Faison, waiting for him to say something, anything, to soften what his wife had just said, to remind her, or maybe to remind himself, of everything we had survived together. But he just stood there, envelope still in his hand, eyes somewhere over my shoulder, unable to meet mine. "I'm going to go inside," I said quietly, because I genuinely didn't know what else to do with my body in that moment. My legs simply carried me forward, past both of them, into the house that still smelled like home even as it was quietly being taken from me. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my childhood bedroom, the same one I'd had since I was 6 years old, the wallpaper faded to pale stripes, a poster of some singer I'd loved as a teenager still curling at the corners on the wall, and I stared at the ceiling, running my fingers along the edge of the blanket my mother had sewn for me before she died, and I told myself this was fixable. I told myself families argue, families misunderstand each other, and love always finds its way back to center eventually. But what I didn't know that night was that this was only the beginning. The real blow was still coming, and it would arrive 3 weeks later, dressed as an ordinary Sunday morning, and it would not be gentle, and it would not care how many fevers I had once nursed, how many bicycles I had once steadied, how many years of my own youth I had quietly, willingly handed over so that a 10-year-old boy could grow up feeling safe. For those 3 weeks, I told myself it was a misunderstanding that could still be fixed. I told myself Faison was under pressure, that this wasn't really him talking, that somewhere underneath the coldness was still the boy who used to fall asleep with his head on my shoulder during long bus rides, drooling slightly on my sleeve, and I would never wake him because I didn't want to disturb the peace on his face. I tried, in those weeks, to go on as though nothing had changed. I still cooked dinner most nights. I still asked about Faison's work, still complimented Rabia's new curtains in the living room, still watered the small potted plants my mother had once kept on the windowsill. I think, looking back now, that I was performing a kind of denial, acting out the rhythms of a family that still existed, hoping the acting would somehow make it true again. But there were signs, if I had let myself see them clearly. Rabia began referring to rooms differently. Our room, our kitchen, phrases that had never carried ownership before but now seemed to draw an invisible boundary I was standing just outside of. Faison started coming home later, avoiding the long evening conversations we used to have, finding reasons to retreat to his room early. The house itself seemed to grow colder, even though nothing physical had changed. The same yellow paint, the same crooked gate, the same mango tree, and yet it no longer felt entirely like mine. I tried to talk to him alone once, on a rare evening when Rabia had gone to visit her sister. I found him sitting on the back porch, exactly where we used to sit together as children, watching the sky change color over the mango tree. I sat down beside him, the way I had 1,000 times before, and for a moment, it almost felt normal again. Faison, I said softly, can we talk about the house? Really talk, just the two of us. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the yard. What's there to talk about? It's done, Nyla. It's not just done, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to let the tremor I felt inside leak into my words. This is our home. Our parents' home. I gave up so much to keep this family together after they were gone, not because I wanted something in return, but because I loved you. I need you to understand that this isn't just about paperwork to me. He looked at me then, and for 1 second, I saw something soft flicker behind his eyes, a glimpse of the boy I remembered, the one who used to reach for my hand crossing busy streets, the one who cried into my shoulder at our mother's funeral. But then it was gone, replaced by something harder, something that looked almost like defensiveness dressed up as certainty. You always bring up the past like I owe you my whole life for it, he said, his voice rising slightly. I didn't ask you to raise me, Nyla. That was your choice. You act like I should be grateful forever just because you did what any older sister would have done. Those words cut deeper than anything else he ever said to me, and I've turned them over in my mind 1,000 times since. Not because they were cruel, though they were, but because they revealed something I hadn't wanted to see, something I had been avoiding for months. Somewhere along the way, my sacrifices had stopped looking like love to him. They had started looking like a debt he resented owing, an invisible weight he wanted, more than anything, to finally set down. I went quiet after that conversation. I stopped arguing, stopped bringing up the house, stopped trying to remind him of everything we had shared. I told myself I would simply wait, that time would soften things, that this was a phase born out of a new marriage and misplaced pride, that the brother I knew was still in there somewhere, buried under new pressures and new opinions that weren't fully his own. I want to be honest about something during this period. I was also, quietly, terrified. Not just of losing the house, though that fear sat heavy in my chest every single day. I was terrified of losing him. Of the two things being taken from me, I think losing my brother frightened me more than losing the walls we'd grown up inside. I kept telling myself that if I could just hold on long enough, if I could just be patient enough, kind enough, understanding enough, he would remember who we were to each other before Rabia, before the business plans, before whatever pressures were reshaping him into someone I barely recognized. Then came that Sunday morning. I had gone to visit an old friend, Sanaa, for the weekend. Just 2 nights away. Nothing unusual, something I'd done dozens of times before without a second thought. We spent the weekend the way we always did, drinking too much tea, talking about everything from work stress to old memories, and for those 2 days, I almost forgot about the tension that had settled over my home like a fog. When I came back on Sunday afternoon, my key didn't work. I stood at that crooked, squeaking gate, turning the key over and over in the lock like it was some kind of mistake I could fix through sheer repetition, like if I just tried hard enough, the metal would remember me and let me through. The door opened before I could knock again. It was Rabia. We changed the locks, she said simply, like she was telling me about the weather, like this was the most unremarkable piece of news in the world. Faison thought it was best. You can collect your things. We've put them in boxes by the shed. I stood on the porch of the house where I had learned to walk, where I had buried both my parents' memories into every wall and windowsill, and I was told to collect my things like a tenant who had overstayed her welcome. I felt something inside me crack, quietly, the way ice cracks under weight before it finally gives way completely. "Where's Faison?" I asked, my voice shaking now. All pretense of composure gone. "I want to talk to him. Please, Rabia, just let me talk to him." I looked past her, into the living room where our father's old chair still sat, worn and familiar, and I saw Faison standing near the staircase. The same staircase with a third step that used to creak when we snuck down for midnight snacks as children. He didn't come to the door. He didn't say a single word to me. He just watched, arms folded, as his wife handed me a life reduced to cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly by the shed door. I won't pretend I stayed composed. I broke down right there on the porch, in front of the mango tree that no longer belonged to me, in front of the crooked gate I used to swing on as a child while my father called out warnings from the kitchen window. I begged Faison to come outside and talk to me, just for a minute, just to look me in the eyes, just to explain to my face what had happened to the boy I raised. He didn't move. "Nobody owes you a house, Nyla," he finally called out from where he stood, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, loud enough that I saw curtains twitch in the house across the street. "You need to build your own life instead of hiding behind ours." I remember the exact weight of those words, how they landed somewhere deep in my chest and stayed there for months afterward, echoing at odd hours, while I was brushing my teeth, while I was waiting for a bus, while I was trying to fall asleep in an unfamiliar room. Nobody owes you a house. As if everything I had given, years, money, sleepless nights, my own youth, my own chance at an easier, freer 20s, had simply evaporated into nothing the moment it became inconvenient to remember. As if love could be erased the same way a name could be erased from a property document, with a single signature and a witness in the room. I left with 3 boxes and a broken suitcase, and for the first time in my adult life, I had nowhere to go. I stood at that gate one last time, looking back at the yellow house fading into sand-colored paint, at the mango tree standing exactly where it always had, indifferent to everything that had just happened beneath its branches, and I felt something in me go completely silent, like a phone line cut mid-sentence. I stayed with my friend Sanaa for 2 months after that. She never once complained about the inconvenience, never once made me feel like a burden, and I will be grateful to her for the rest of my life for that kindness during the darkest stretch of my adulthood. But even her kindness couldn't fill the hollow space where my home used to be. I cried more in those 2 months than I had in the previous 10 years combined. There were nights I genuinely wondered what the point of any of it had been, the years of sacrifice, the choices I made to put someone else's future before my own, the youth I'd handed over so freely, believing love like that always circles back eventually. I felt hollow, like someone had reached into my chest and scooped out everything that used to be steady in there, leaving only an echo where certainty used to live. I remember one night in particular, sitting on Sanaa's small balcony overlooking a street that wasn't mine, in a city that suddenly felt unfamiliar even though I had lived in it my whole life. I thought about my mother's hands guiding mine over a cutting board in that kitchen, patient and warm. I thought about my father's laugh under that mango tree, the way it used to shake the whole yard. I thought about a small boy learning to ride a bicycle, wobbling, finding his balance, pedaling away from me into sunlight I had made sure was safe for him to ride into. And somewhere in the middle of that memory, something shifted inside me. Not all at once, but like a key slowly turning in a lock that had been jammed for months. I realized something that would change the entire direction of my life from that point forward. That house held my history, yes. Every wall, every creaking stair, every faded stripe of wallpaper carried a piece of who I was. But Faison didn't hold the deed to my worth. He held a piece of paper. That was all he ever really had. My worth had never lived inside those walls. It had lived inside me, all along, waiting to be remembered. I stopped crying that night, not because the pain disappeared, but because something steadier had begun to take its place. In that new, quiet steadiness, a plan began to form, not out of hatred, not out of a desire to hurt him the way he had hurt me, but out of a deep, unshakable need to reclaim something that had been taken from me in the cruelest, most calculated way possible. I went back to work with a focus I hadn't had in years. I picked up extra freelance projects on the weekends, staying up late at Sanaa's small kitchen table, typing until my eyes burned, telling myself every hour of exhaustion was a brick being laid towards something I couldn't yet fully see. I stopped spending on anything that wasn't necessary. No new clothes, no small luxuries, no comfort spending to numb the grief the way I might have allowed myself before. Sanaa thought I was just trying to distract myself from the pain, and in a way, she was right. But there was more to it than that, something I didn't fully explain to her at the time, because I wasn't ready to say it out loud, as if speaking it might somehow curse it before it had the chance to grow. I was quietly rebuilding, piece by piece, the way you rebuild a house after a storm, starting with the foundation nobody can see, the part that takes the longest and matters the most.
2 years passed like this.
Slow, deliberate, unglamorous years of discipline that nobody around me fully understood or noticed. I moved into a small rented apartment eventually, modest but entirely mine, and I filled it sparsely, saving every spare amount I could toward a goal I hadn't yet spoken aloud to anyone. In that time, I heard through relatives that Faizan and Rabia were struggling. He had taken a large loan against the house to fund a business idea, some import venture he'd become convinced would make him independently wealthy, something he'd apparently been planning even before he locked me out, which told me more about the true reasons behind that Sunday morning than anything he'd said to my face. The business failed within a year. The whispers grew louder at family gatherings I still occasionally attended out of respect for distant relatives, unpaid debts, arguments with lenders, a business partner who had disappeared with the remaining capital, leaving Faizan holding an obligation far larger than he could manage on his salary alone. The house I grew up in was now collateral for a decision that had gone terribly, terribly wrong. I felt something complicated when I heard that news, something I want to be honest about rather than pretend away for the sake of a cleaner story. There was no pure joy in imagining my brother's stress, his sleepless nights, the same kind of fear I had once felt standing on that porch with 3 cardboard boxes at my feet. I am not a cruel person, and despite everything, some small part of me still ached at the thought of him suffering. But there was something else too, quieter and colder, sitting alongside that ache. Recognition. The universe, it seemed, had its own patient way of settling accounts, even when the people involved never intended to be its instruments. Then, one afternoon, I received a call from a distant cousin who worked in property, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who apparently still followed the family grapevine closely. He told me, almost casually, that our childhood home had been listed with a bank-appointed agent, quietly, discreetly, before the debt situation became public and humiliating for the family name Faizan cared so much about protecting. He mentioned it almost as gossip, some interesting piece of news to pass along, with no idea what those words would set into motion. I sat with that information for 3 full days before I made a decision. I didn't go to Faizan during those 3 days. I didn't call him, didn't confront him, didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing I even knew about his situation. I sat with the information the way you sit with something fragile, turning it over carefully in your hands, examining it from every angle before deciding what to do with it. Instead, on the 4th day, I went to the property agent directly, under my full legal name, and I asked for every detail about the listing, the asking price, the timeline, the circumstances of the sale. The agent had no idea who I was in relation to the property, and I gave him no reason to suspect anything beyond a straightforward buyer's interest. The house had dropped significantly in value due to the rushed, discreet sale. Faizan needed the money fast, quietly, before word spread through the community that he had lost the property his own sister had helped maintain for years, before the humiliation of that failure became public knowledge among people whose opinions he had always cared about more than he ever admitted. That urgency, born from his pride, worked entirely in my favor. I had spent 2 years saving, investing carefully, taking on work I never would have imagined myself doing when I was still living comfortably inside that yellow house, believing my future was secure. I had built, slowly and without anyone's help, without a single loan or favor from family. Exactly enough. Not through luck. Through 2 years of quiet, disciplined, almost invisible labor that nobody around me had fully understood at the time. I made an offer through the agent, using a separate legal entity so my name wouldn't immediately connect to the sale. I didn't do this out of shame, and I want to be clear about that. I did it because I wanted the moment of realization to belong entirely to me. I wanted to choose when and how Faison discovered the truth, the same way he had chosen when and how to take that truth away from me on that Sunday morning 2 years earlier. If he had taught me anything, however unintentionally, it was that timing was its own form of power. The negotiation took 3 weeks. There were moments I doubted myself, moments I wondered whether I was making a decision rooted in healing or one rooted in something closer to obsession, whether reclaiming that house would actually bring me peace, or whether I was simply chasing the ghost of a life that no longer existed. I talked it through with Sanaa more than once, staying up late on her balcony the way we used to during my darkest months. "Do you think this is about the house?" she asked me one night. "Or is it about him?" I thought about that question for a long time before I answered. I finally said, "It's about proving to myself that what he said wasn't true. That somebody did owe me something, not a house exactly. Respect. Acknowledgement. The truth of everything I gave. And if he won't give me that voluntarily, then I'll take back the one thing that can hold all of it, the walls that watched me give it." She nodded slowly, and though I don't think she fully understood the depth of what I meant, she squeezed my hand and told me she trusted whatever I decided. The sale closed on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I remember sitting in the agent's small office, signing the final papers with a hand that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something closer to disbelief, the sense of a circle finally closing after 2 years of walking through its long, difficult arc. When I stepped outside that gate again afterward, keys in my hand, real keys this time, ones that actually opened the lock, I felt something inside me settle for the first time in 2 years, like a held breath finally released. I stood at that crooked gate for a long time before I even opened it. I looked at the faded yellow paint, the mango tree visible over the fence line, its branches heavier with fruit than I remembered. I thought about my father planting that tree the year I was born. I thought about my mother's hands over mine on a cutting board. I thought about a small boy taking his first wobbling steps toward my outstretched arms. I let myself back into the house alone that evening, walking slowly through each room, running my fingers along walls that still remembered every version of me that had ever lived inside them. Faison and Rabia's furniture was still there, packed haphazardly in places, clear signs of a hurried, humiliated exit that had already happened without my involvement. The bank's process had moved forward regardless of my personal connection to the sale, and by the time my ownership was finalized, they had already been required to vacate. I gave it 1 more week before I told him anything directly. I wanted him to have time to settle wherever he and Rabia had gone, to have the initial shock of losing the house on its own terms first, separate from anything I had done, so that when the second truth arrived, it would land with its own clarity rather than getting tangled up in the chaos of eviction and moving trucks. I invited Faison to meet me at a small cafe near my old workplace, somewhere neutral, somewhere that held no memories for either of us, deliberately chosen so that nothing in the environment could soften or complicate what I needed to say. He looked thinner than I remembered when he walked in, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years earlier. Whatever pride had fueled him that Sunday morning, the pride that let him stand in a doorway and watch his own sister hand carry 3 boxes of her entire life to a car, had clearly been worn down by the weight of everything that followed. He sat down across from me, and for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. "I heard about the house," I said simply, watching his face carefully, giving nothing away in my own expression. He looked down at his coffee, stirring it slowly, though he hadn't added anything to it.
Yeah.
"Bad investment.
Bad partner.
It happens, I guess." He tried to say it lightly, the way people try to make peace with things they haven't actually made peace with at all, his voice cracking slightly at the edges despite the casual words. "I bought it," I said. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence I had ever experienced in my entire life. I watched every emotion cross his face in slow, unguarded succession, confusion first, his eyebrows drawing together like he genuinely couldn't process the sentence. Then disbelief, his mouth opening slightly as though to argue before any words arrived. And then something that looked almost like shame, though I couldn't be fully sure, because shame had never been an emotion I'd seen on Faison's face before, not once in all our years together, not even at our mother's funeral when he'd cried openly into my shoulder. "You what?" he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I bought the house, Faison. Our house. The one you told me nobody owed me." I kept my voice steady, calm, the way I had practiced in my head more times than I could count over the past 3 weeks. "I found out it was being sold. I made an offer. It closed last Thursday." He didn't say anything for a long time. His hands were shaking slightly around his coffee cup, and I watched him try to compose himself, try to find some version of dignity to hold on to in a moment that had clearly stripped it entirely away. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I had ever heard it, smaller even than it had been as a frightened child at our father's funeral. "Nyla, he stopped. Started again. "I don't know what to say." "I'm not here for an apology," I said, and I meant it, though a smaller, quieter part of me had hoped for years that one might eventually come. "I'm here because I want you to know that everything you thought you took from me that day, you didn't actually take. You just delayed it. I built my own life, exactly like you told me to. And it turns out my own life includes that mango tree, that crooked gate, and every room our parents ever stood in." I didn't shout. I didn't cry, though I had cried plenty in the days leading up to this conversation, alone, where he would never see it. I simply said what needed to be said, calmly, the way you'd state a fact rather than deliver a wound, because I had learned, somewhere in those 2 hard years, that the calmest words often land the heaviest. He was quiet for a while, staring at the table between us, and when he looked up again, his eyes were wet. "I think about that day a lot," he said finally, his voice barely holding together. "What Rabia said, what I said. I've thought about it more than you probably think I have." "Why didn't you ever say anything then?" I asked, and I genuinely wanted to know, not out of anger anymore, but out of a real desire to understand the brother I had once known so completely. "Pride, I think," he admitted, his voice cracking further. "And maybe fear that if I admitted I was wrong, I'd have to admit how much I actually needed you my whole life, and I didn't know how to carry that and still feel like a man who'd built something of his own." It was the most honest thing he had said to me in over 2 years, and despite everything, I felt something in my chest loosen slightly at hearing it. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a path that might eventually lead there if we both wanted to walk it. He asked, quietly, almost too afraid to say it out loud, if there was any way he could stay in the house, even as a tenant, even temporarily, while he and Rabia figured out their next steps. I thought about it, really thought about it, because despite everything, some part of me still remembered the boy whose fevers I sat through until dawn, the boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on long bus rides. But I said no. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. Because if I had said yes, I would have simply been rebuilding the exact same pattern that broke me in the first place, giving endlessly, without protection, without boundary, hoping love alone would be remembered when it mattered most, hoping that generosity would somehow guarantee I'd never be discarded again. I had learned, painfully, through 2 years of cardboard boxes and borrowed rooms and quiet, disciplined rebuilding, that love without boundaries isn't strength. It's just an open door that people walk through and forget to close behind them. "I hope you find somewhere good," I told him, and I meant it sincerely, without bitterness. "I hope you and Rabia rebuild, in whatever way makes sense for you. But I'm not going to be the safety net this time. I spent 8 years being that for you, gladly, and then I spent 2 more years learning how to be that for myself instead. I can't go backward now, not even for you." He nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, something I had never once seen him do as an adult. "That's fair," he said quietly. "That's more than fair." I told him I wished him well, genuinely, and that I hoped someday, once enough time had passed and enough healing had happened on both sides, we could find our way back to something resembling the relationship we used to have, not the same because too much had changed for it to ever be exactly the same again, but something honest, something real, built on truth instead of old debts neither of us had ever properly named out loud. I told him our parents would want peace between us, even if that peace looked different than either of us had once expected it to. And then I walked out of that cafe and drove back to the house, my house alone. That evening, I sat under the mango tree in the backyard, the same one my father planted the year I was born, and I let myself cry, not from grief this time, but from something closer to release, the kind of crying that empties you out in order to make room for something new to settle in. I thought about all the versions of myself that had passed through that yard over the years. The girl who caught her baby brother's first steps and felt her heart swell with a love she didn't yet have words for. The teenager who stood at her father's funeral, holding a 10-year-old shaking hand. The young woman who buried both her parents within 4 years of each other and somehow kept walking forward anyway. The exhausted, heartbroken sister standing on a porch with 3 cardboard boxes, listening to words that tried to convince her she was owed nothing. And now, this version of me, quieter, steadier, home in every sense of the word. I didn't get my revenge through cruelty, and looking back now, I'm deeply grateful for that because cruelty would have left me hollow in a different way, would have made me someone I didn't recognize in the mirror. I got it through patience. Through 2 years of quiet, unglamorous discipline that nobody around me fully understood at the time. Through building something so solid, so entirely my own, that no one could take it from me twice. And in the end, that's the lesson I carry with me now, the one I hope reaches whoever is listening to this story tonight, wherever you are, whatever version of this pain you might be carrying yourself. If someone makes you feel like your love, your sacrifice, your years of quiet devotion were worth nothing, don't waste your energy proving them wrong through anger, through shouting matches, through bitterness that eats away at you from the inside while they go on with their lives untouched. Prove it through what you build afterward, quietly, patiently, on your own terms and in your own time. Betrayal can take a house, a title, a piece of paper with your name conveniently missing from it, but it can never take your ability to rise, rebuild, and reclaim your own peace, brick by brick, day by day, until one day you look up and realize you're standing somewhere solid again. I still live in that house today. The gate still squeaks no matter how much oil I put on it, and honestly, I've stopped trying to fix it. I've grown fond of that particular imperfection, the way it announces every visitor the same way it always has. The mango tree still drops fruit onto the tin roof every summer. Thud, thud, thud. The same sound that once meant childhood, and now means something even better. It means I came home to myself, fully, without needing anyone's permission or anyone's signature to make it true. Faison and I speak occasionally now, carefully, the way 2 people rebuild trust after it's been shattered, slowly, without rushing, without pretending the past didn't happen. It's not what it used to be. I don't know if it ever fully will be. But there's honesty between us now that wasn't there before, and I've come to believe that honesty, even painful honesty, is worth more than the comfortable silence we used to live inside. And that, in the end, is a kind of justice no courtroom could have ever given me. Not the house itself, though I'm grateful every single day to sit under that mango tree again. The real justice was becoming someone who could never again be told, by anyone, that she wasn't owed the life she had built with her own 2 hands. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been made to feel small for loving someone too deeply, too generously, too completely, I hope you remember tonight that patience, quiet discipline, and unshakable self-respect will always outlast anyone's attempt to convince you that you don't deserve what you've earned. Build slowly. Build quietly. And one day, you'll find yourself standing exactly where you were always meant to be. Home, in every sense of the word.